The train didn't just move, it screamed. It was a metal beast clawing its way over frozen tracks, and with every lurch, every shriek of steel on ice, Lillian Hayes felt her own resolve starting to crack. Outside, there was nothing. A great, roaring whiteness had devoured the world, erasing the sky, the plains of Wyoming, and any hope of seeing what lay ahead. It was a blizzard that had come from nowhere, a monster of wind and snow. Lillian gripped the armrest, the leather of her gloves groaning in protest. Her own reflection, faint on the frosted glass, was a pale, determined ghost. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her either very brave or very, very foolish. She hadn't decided which yet. The wind found every crack in the carriage, spitting tiny flakes of ice that stung her skin like needles. A conductor, his face etched with worry, stumbled down the aisle, muttering about the mountain pass, about how it wasn't kind to travelers tonight. You could feel the fear in the air, thick and cold. But Lillian didn't look up. Her eyes were locked on the storm. Her mind was spinning, a frantic wheel of what-ifs. What was a little fear to her now? She'd already survived the slow, painful death of her old life. A grand home in Charleston sold off piece by painful piece. A family name whispered with pity in parlors she could no longer enter. The hollow, echoing silence of her mother's deathbed. Once Lillian Hayes had belonged to a world of white columns and jasmine gardens. Now, everything she owned was packed into a single battered suitcase, along with a worn shawl and a small wooden box. That box held the last fragments of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. A violent jolt threw her against the seat. The gas lamps overhead flickered wildly, dancing across the anxious faces of the other passengers. A man cursed. A child began to whimper. The train was slowing, grinding, screeching to a crawl. For a terrifying moment, Lillian thought they would stop right there, stranded in the heart of the white wilderness, a tomb of iron and snow. Will we make it through? The question came from the woman across from her, a stout matron bundled in wool. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. You're not from around these parts, are you, dear? Going to family? Lillian forced a smile that felt brittle, fragile. No, she said, her voice a near whisper. Not family. How could she explain? How could she put words to the desperation that had led her here? She was traveling 1,000 miles to meet a man she'd never seen, a man whose letter was stripped of all kindness, all poetry. It had said only this: there's food and work. I don't speak sweet words, but I don't lie. It wasn't a promise of happiness. It wasn't comfort. But it was real. And real was a currency she was desperately short on back in Charleston. The woman nodded, a knowing look in her eyes, the kind that says it has seen 100 stories just like hers. Lillian turned back to the window. It would be so easy for the snow to swallow them whole, to bury their stories, their secrets, under a blanket of eternal silence. A shiver, sharp and deep, ran down her spine. It wasn't just the cold, a new thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through her carefully constructed calm. What if he doesn't want me? What if she'd crossed a continent just to be turned away like a stray dog? Her hand tightened on her bag, her fingers finding the familiar shape of the small wooden box inside. It held her mother's frayed photograph, a blue ribbon from a happier time, and a letter from her sister, Catherine. A letter that had arrived just after the funeral. A letter she still hadn't dared to open. She couldn't bear the pity. She couldn't bear the lectures. The train shuddered one last time, its wheels grinding to a final, definitive stop. Through a small, clear patch on the window, she saw it. A faint shape, barely a suggestion of a building, a station platform half swallowed by snow. A voice shouted down the aisle, muffled and distant. Jackson Hole! Next stop! Jackson Hole! Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. No turning back now. She pulled her shawl tight, adjusted her gloves, and lifted her heavy suitcase. The doors hissed open, and the world outside roared in. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The platform was a swirling vortex of white, almost completely deserted. Almost. A man stood by a wagon, a tall, unmoving silhouette against the storm. He wore a heavy coat, its collar turned up, a hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just watched. Cole Barrett. She knew it was him. There was a stillness to him, a guarded, deliberate immobility that felt as harsh as the landscape itself. Lillian took a deep breath and stepped forward, the snow sucking at her boots with every step. When she finally reached him, he didn't offer a hand, didn't offer a smile. His eyes, a chilling gray that matched the storm, swept over her. It wasn't a look of welcome. It was an assessment, a quick, brutal inventory. "Miss Hayes," he said. His voice was low, flat, devoid of any warmth. "You made it. Weather's getting worse." No welcome, no kindness, just a fact. Lillian's grip on her suitcase handle was the only thing keeping her upright. "I suppose it is," she managed to say, the words freezing on her lips. "Come on," he said, already turning away. He grabbed her suitcase with one hand, tossing it into the back of the wagon as if it weighed nothing. Then he climbed onto the driver's seat and waited. The message was clear: keep up or be left behind. The ride was a long, punishing silence. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves in the deep snow and the howl of the wind, which sometimes sounded like wolves. Lillian stole glances at him, his profile a hard, unforgiving line against the snow. His jaw was set, tight, the jaw of a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world than sitting next to her. As they climbed higher, a dark shape emerged from the blur. A wooden house on a ridge, standing alone against the fury of the elements. Its windows were dark, shuttered. No smoke curled from its chimney. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress. When the wagon stopped, Cole jumped down. He didn't offer her a hand. As her boots hit the snow, a sudden explosion of barking erupted from the side of the house. 7 dogs, lean and sharp-eyed, materialized from the shadows. They circled her, their growls low, menacing rumbles in their chests. Lillian froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Back!" Cole commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind with an absolute authority that made the dogs instantly fall silent. They obeyed, but their eyes, glinting in the dim light, never left her. They were as guarded, as suspicious, as their master. He pushed open the heavy cabin door and motioned her inside. As she stepped over the threshold into the cold, silent darkness of the house, a single, terrifying thought echoed in her mind. What have I done? The door groaned shut behind her, sealing her inside. The air in the cabin was thick, heavy with the smell of old wood smoke, damp fur, and something else. Something like old, settled grief. The narrow hallway was lost in shadows. Firewood was stacked against one wall, looking like it had been dropped there in a hurry months ago and never touched again. Cole didn't even take off his hat. He just turned to her, his gray eyes as cold and empty as the landscape outside. "Your room's at the end of the hall, stove's in there. There's hot water on the hearth, dinner's on the table." Each sentence was a flat, hard stone dropped into the silence. Before she could even form a word of thanks, he was reaching for another heavy coat from a peg by the door. "I need to check the fence line before it's completely dark. Storm might have brought it down." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. His next words were strange, chilling. "You'll be safe in here." Then he was gone. The door slammed, and the wind and the barking of the dogs were all that was left of him. Safe? Lillian stood frozen in the hallway, her suitcase a leaden weight in her hand. The silence that pressed in on her from all sides felt like the least safe thing in the world. It was a watchful silence, a heavy silence. She walked down the creaking hallway to the room he'd indicated. It was stark, bare, a narrow bed with a single gray blanket, a wooden chair, a small window covered by a rough curtain. The small stove in the corner offered only the faintest whisper of warmth. This wasn't a guest room. It was a cell. She placed her suitcase on the bed, but didn't open it. She couldn't. She walked back into the main part of the house, her boots echoing on the floorboards. The kitchen was cleaner than she'd expected, but it was the tidiness of neglect, not care. A few chipped dishes on the counter, a half-empty jar of molasses. a loaf of bread that looked hard enough to be a weapon. She lit a lantern, and its weak glow pushed the shadows back into the corners. On the stove sat a pot. She lifted the lid, a congealed stew. The smell of beef and carrots was familiar but hollow. It was food cooked for fuel, not for comfort. She could tell no one had tasted it while they cooked. No one had cared. Slowly, methodically, she began to move. She pulled off her gloves, warming her aching fingers by the hearth. She found more wood, stoked the fire until it roared back to life, chasing the oppressive chill from the room. She washed the dishes, her hands working automatically, finding a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive task. If she could clean this one small corner of this cold, hard place, maybe she could steady her own heart. The wind howled, rattling the windows. Outside, the dogs barked, a sudden, furious chorus, then fell silent again. A movement in the corner of her eye made her jump. One of the dogs, an old hound with pale, knowing eyes, was standing in the doorway, watching her. Its head was tilted, its posture a mixture of curiosity and deep suspicion. "Hello?" she murmured. The dog's tail gave a single, cautious flick. It didn't move closer. Lillian crouched, extending a hand slowly. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." The hound just blinked, then turned and vanished back into the shadows of the hallway as silently as it had appeared. She leaned against the counter, her breath coming out in a shaky sigh. Everything here was guarded. The man, the animals, the house itself. It was a fortress of silence and suspicion. It was well past dark when Cole returned. He entered like a ghost, covered in snow, and said nothing as he shut the door against the storm. The dogs swarmed him, their tails wagging, a frantic, loving welcome reserved only for him. "Dinner is warm," Lillian said quietly. She'd reheated the stew and found some softer bread wrapped in a cloth. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He just sat at the table and ate. His movements quick, efficient, mechanical. When he was done, he rinsed his bowl at the basin, paused, and gave a stiff nod in her direction. "Good stew," he said, the words sounding like they were pulled from him against his will. Then he turned and disappeared down the hall, his heavy footsteps ascending a set of stairs she hadn't noticed before. Lillian stayed in the kitchen, the firelight playing across her face. She tidied up, listening to the sounds of him moving above her. Slow, heavy, pacing. Had he even considered that she might be terrified? Alone in this strange, isolated place, surrounded by a blizzard, a pack of menacing dogs, and a silence that felt heavier than the snow? Of course he hadn't. She was just a piece of a transaction. The help. She banked the fire for the night and climbed the stairs to her own small, cold room. The wooden box with her mother's photo and her sister's unopened letter sat on the little table beside the bed. She ran a hand over the smooth wood, but couldn't bring herself to open it. To look at the past felt like a betrayal of the terrifying present she had to survive. She lay down on the hard mattress, still fully clothed, and stared up at the dark ceiling. The house groaned and creaked around her, each sound a word in a language she didn't understand. The dogs barked once, a sharp, questioning sound, then fell silent. Sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, the feeling of being completely and utterly invisible. She was a ghost in this house already, a phantom presence he refused to see. Her thoughts drifted back to Charleston, to Jasmine and laughter and the soft touch of her mother's hand. That life was gone. It was ash. But the ache of it, the ghost of it, remained. The wind howled a lonely, mournful cry like a warning. Lillian closed her eyes, her lips barely moving as she whispered into the darkness, "I will make this place see me. I will." It was sometime in the dead of night when a sound pulled her from a restless sleep. A whimper. High-pitched, desperate, and terrifyingly close. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't coming from inside the house. Heart-pounding, she crept from the bed. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and moved silently down the hall, her bare feet numb on the icy floorboards. She eased open the back door, and the cold was a physical slap, a blast of wind and swirling snow that took her breath away. And then she saw it. A small, dark shape near the barn, a tiny mound in a snowdrift that was growing by the second. A puppy. It was half buried, trembling so violently it could barely lift its head. Its whimpers were tiny, pathetic needles of sound in the roaring storm. All thought vanished. All fear was forgotten. She didn't hesitate. She ran. The snow was deep, biting, but she plunged through it, her only focus on that tiny, struggling life. She scooped the puppy into her arms, its small body a block of ice, its breathing terrifyingly shallow. She pressed it against her chest, turning her back to the wind, and fought her way back to the cabin. By the time she stumbled inside, her feet were numb, her face raw. She collapsed by the hearth, wrapping the puppy in the driest, warmest thing she could find, her own shawl. She rubbed its tiny body, trying to force life back into it. Its shivering began to subside, its eyes, milky and unfocused, flickered open. It was alive. A floorboard creaked behind her. Lillian looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Cole was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. His shirt was unbuttoned, his hair was a mess. He had clearly been woken by her frantic return. His face was a mask of shadows, impossible to read, but his voice, when he spoke, was low and dangerously firm. "You should not have gone out there." Lillian looked down at the tiny, fragile creature in her lap, then back up at the cold, hard man in the doorway. A fire she didn't know she possessed flared to life inside her. "And you," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "should not have left him out there to die." For a long, silent moment, they just stared at each other. The roaring fire, the howling storm, the man and the woman. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Then, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something she couldn't name. His gaze softened just for an instant, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness of the house. Lillian pulled the puppy closer, whispering to it, her voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. You're safe now." The storm raged on, a wild thing tearing at the world. But inside the cabin, in the warm glow of the fire, something else had just begun. Something small and fragile, and ferociously alive. The next morning, the world was silent, muffled under a thick blanket of new snow. A pale, weak light filtered through the curtain, turning Lillian's room a stark gray. At the foot of her bed, the puppy slept, a tiny, breathing lump under her wool blanket. She named him Scout. He was a survivor, just like her. For the first time since arriving, a flicker of purpose warmed her. It was a small thing, but it was real. She dressed quickly and went downstairs. The main room was empty, the fire burned down to glowing embers. Cole was already gone. His coat and boots were missing from the door. Through the kitchen window, she could see a fresh set of tracks leading toward the barn. This place, it wasn't a home. It was a station of endurance, a place where a man was simply waiting out the winter of his own heart. She saw the disarray with new eyes. Muddy tracks on the floor, scattered dog bowls, a pile of unwashed linens. It was the chaos of a life without a center. She rolled up her sleeves. She stoked the fire, set water to boil, and began to clean. She swept the floors, wiped down the counters, scrubbed the congealed stew from the pot. By the time Cole returned, stamping snow from his boots, the kitchen was transformed. A fire roared in the hearth. The scent of hot coffee and baking biscuits filled the air. Scout was curled in a makeshift bed in a basket near the fire, warm and safe. Cole stopped dead in the doorway. His eyes darted from the clean floor to the set table, to the sleeping puppy, and finally to her. His brow furrowed. He looked completely, utterly bewildered, as if he'd walked into the wrong house. "You were out early," she said, her back to him as she poured oatmeal into bowls. "Had to check the stock," he replied, his voice flat, but she could hear the confusion in it. "The fences held." "That's good," she said. She placed a bowl in front of him. The puppy is much stronger. I'm calling him Scout. Cole glanced at the basket. His expression was still unreadable, but the hard line of his mouth seemed to soften just a fraction. Names don't mean much to dogs, he said. They do to people, she replied, finally turning to meet his gaze. His gray eyes held hers for a moment, and for the first time she thought she saw something other than coldness there. It was surprise. He didn't argue. He just ate his oatmeal in a silence that felt different from the day before. It wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful. Later that day, she found herself in the attic. She was looking for old rags to use for cleaning, but she found something else instead. The air up there was cold and still, smelling of dust and forgotten time. In the corner, tucked behind a stack of old crates, was a small wooden trunk. It wasn't locked. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, was a woman's dress, a simple thing of blue calico. Beneath it were books, their pages filled with a delicate, flowing handwriting, and at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was a violation, but she couldn't stop herself. She opened the journal. The first page read, Eliza Barrett. This land is my heart. Lillian's breath caught. She sat on the dusty floorboards and began to read. Eliza's words painted a picture of a life that was the complete opposite of the one Lillian now inhabited, a life filled with love and laughter and hope. She wrote of Cole not as a silent, grieving ghost, but as a man who laughed, who held her, who shared her dreams for this ranch. She wrote of the dogs not as guards, but as companions, and she wrote of the future, a future filled with children and prosperity. Then, the entries began to change. The tone grew fearful, secretive. Martin was here again today. He looks at this land with a hunger that frightens me. He doesn't see the beauty. He sees only what's underneath it. Cole doesn't believe me. He thinks it's just sibling rivalry. Lillian's blood ran cold. Martin, the brother. The last entry was short, hurried, the handwriting shaky. He knows I found the old map. He followed me to the caves behind the ridge. I told Cole I was looking for a lost dog. I had to. I can't let him have it. This land belongs to the future, not to his greed. If something happens to me... The entry stopped there. Lillian slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't an accident. Eliza hadn't just wandered off into a storm. She had gone to hide something from Martin, and she had never come back. Suddenly, Cole's grief wasn't just sadness. It was a prison of guilt. He thought she had died because of a lost dog. He thought it was his fault for not going after her himself. He had no idea she had been protecting him, protecting the ranch, from his own brother. A new, chilling thought struck her. The letter that had brought her here. I don't speak sweet words, but I don't lie. She pulled it from her pocket, her fingers trembling. She ran back downstairs and found an old ledger on a shelf, one Cole sometimes used. She opened it. His handwriting was stark, functional, nothing like the writing on the letter. Her eyes darted back to the attic, to the journal, to Eliza's delicate, flowing script. It was a perfect match. Eliza had written the letter. Lillian wasn't here because a grieving widower needed a wife. She was here because a dying woman had been looking for her own replacement. A woman to protect the man she loved from a truth she knew would destroy him. A woman to stand guard over a secret she had died to protect. Lillian sank into a chair, the letter and the journal on the table in front of her. The whole world had just tilted on its axis. She wasn't a mail-order bride. She was a ghost's last, desperate plan. The silence of the house was no longer just empty. It was filled with unspoken words, with secrets buried under the snow, and Lillian realized with a terrifying certainty that the blizzard that had brought her here was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. She had to know what was in those caves. She had to know what Eliza had died for, and she had a horrifying feeling that Martin Barrett would be back to find it. The revelation settled over Lillian like a shroud. Every interaction, Every cold silence from Cole was recast in a new tragic light. He wasn't just grieving a loss, he was living in a lie, a prison of guilt built by his wife's final protective act. Lillian now moved through the house with a different purpose. She wasn't just a hired hand or a prospective wife, she was the keeper of a dead woman's secret, a secret that felt like a live coal in her hands. She started watching Cole, truly watching him. She saw the way his eyes would drift towards the distant ridge, the one Eliza mentioned in her journal. She saw the profound sadness that would settle over him whenever he worked with the dogs, the ones Eliza had loved. He wasn't just a cold man. He was a haunted one, tormented by a ghost whose true story he didn't even know. She had to tell him. But how? How could she shatter the memory of the woman he loved, only to replace it with a story of betrayal and conspiracy? The truth would free him from his guilt, but it would also force him to see his own brother as a monster. Before she could decide, the monster returned. Martin Barrett rode up one afternoon, his fine horse and polished boots a stark insult to the rugged landscape. He dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a cold, appraising gaze. Lillian was outside, splitting firewood, a task she'd taught herself, with Scout yapping at her heels. Martin's eyes landed on her, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, well, Brother Cole finally replaced the broken furniture. Lillian's grip tightened on the axe handle. "I'm not furniture," she said, her voice steady. "And this isn't your house." Martin's smirk widened. He took a step closer, his presence radiating a slick, predatory menace. "Not yet, it isn't. But things change, people disappear, debts come due." He was looking at her, but she knew he was talking about Eliza. He was testing her, seeing what she knew. Cole emerged from the barn, his face hardening into a mask of stone the moment he saw his brother. "Martin, what do you want?" "Just checking on my investment, little brother," Martin said, his tone dripping with false concern. "The bank's getting impatient. They send their regards. Spring is coming, Cole, and so are the collectors." His eyes flickered to Lillian again. "Unless you've found some other way to pay your debts? Does she have a hidden fortune you haven't told me about?" The air crackled with tension. Cole stepped forward, placing himself between Martin and Lillian. It was a protective gesture, instinctive and fierce, and it sent a strange warmth through her. "Her name is Lillian," Cole said, his voice a low growl, "and she is none of your business." "Oh, I think she is," Martin countered smoothly. "Anyone living on this land is my business, especially someone who seems to have settled in. You know, Cole, Eliza was a settler too. She loved digging around in places she shouldn't have been. It's a dangerous hobby in these mountains." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked, glittering blade held to all their throats. Lillian felt her blood run cold. He knew she had the journal, or he suspected it. He was trying to flush her out. She had to make a choice, right now. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "She wasn't digging, Martin," Lillian said, her voice ringing out in the still, cold air. "She was protecting." Both men froze. Martin's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, cold fury. Cole turned to look at her, his face a canvas of utter confusion. "What are you talking about?" Cole asked. "Your wife, Cole," Lillian said, her eyes locked on Martin's. "She didn't die chasing a dog. She died hiding something from him." She pointed a trembling finger at Martin. "She wrote it all down, in her journal, about the old map, the caves, about how you followed her. She knew you wouldn't stop until you got what you wanted." Martin's face went pale. For a moment, he looked genuinely shaken. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the ghost of his sister-in-law. Cole just stared, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossible words she was saying. "Journal? What journal?" But Martin recovered quickly, his shock morphing into a sneer. "She's delirious, Cole. A desperate woman spinning fantasies. Are you going to believe this? This nobody over your own blood? He took a step towards Lillian, his eyes blazing. Where is it? Where is the journal? It's safe, Lillian said, standing her ground. Behind her, Scout let out a low growl, the fur on his neck bristling. The other dogs, drawn by the commotion, had begun to emerge from the barn, their movements slow, silent, and watchful. They formed a loose semicircle, their pale eyes fixed on Martin. They remembered him. You're a fool, Cole, Martin spat, his eyes darting from Lillian to the dogs, a flicker of fear finally showing. You're protecting a liar and a treasure map that probably doesn't even exist. When the bank takes this place, don't come crying to me. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the dogs. He swung himself onto his horse, his movements jerky and panicked. This isn't over, he yelled, digging his heels into the horse's sides and galloping away, a frantic retreat into the wilderness. The silence he left behind was deafening. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Cole turned to Lillian. His face was a storm of emotions, disbelief, pain, confusion, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Lillian, he whispered, his voice cracking, what have you done? Cole looked at her as if she were a stranger, a creature who had just torn down the entire architecture of his world. A journal? He asked again, his voice hollow. Show me. She didn't hesitate. She led him into the house, the silent, watchful dogs trailing behind them as if they were a jury. She retrieved the journal from its hiding place and laid it on the kitchen table. The room was filled with the fading afternoon light, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Cole's hands trembled as he opened it. He read, his face growing paler with every page. He read about his own laughter, his own tenderness, things he thought were buried forever. He read about Eliza's love for him, a love so fierce it was like a physical presence in the room. And then he read about her fear, about Martin's greed, about the map, and about her final, desperate plan. He sank into a chair, the journal falling from his fingers. The sound of his own ragged breath was the only noise in the room. The guilt he had carried for 3 years, the crushing weight of believing he had let his wife die, was suddenly gone. But in its place was a new, terrible agony. The image of Eliza, alone, terrified, choosing to face his brother in a freezing cave rather than risk Cole's life. The man he thought he knew, the brother he had grown up with, was a monster who had left his wife to die in the dark. All this time, he whispered, his voice breaking, all this time I thought it was my fault. Lillian knelt beside his chair, her heart aching for him. She did it to protect you, Cole. She loved you that much. He looked at her then, his gray eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and in them she saw the man Eliza had written about, the kind, gentle man buried under years of grief and guilt. And you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She sent you. Her letter. It brought you here. Lillian nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. I think she knew you wouldn't survive this alone. She was looking for someone who could fight for you, for this place. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Cole's cheek. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid of hurting you more, afraid you wouldn't believe me. I believe you, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. Martin's greed. I never wanted to see it. But it was always there. I see that now. He stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked to the window and stared out at the ridge, the place where Eliza had met her end. A new resolve was hardening in his eyes, chasing away the confusion. It was the look of a man who finally knew who his enemy was. He'll be back, Cole said, his voice flat and cold as ice. He won't give up, not as long as he thinks that map is here. The journal says she hid it in the caves, Lillian said. Then that's where we have to go. The idea was terrifying. The caves were Eliza's tomb, but it was also the key to everything. The map was the only proof they had against Martin, the only thing that could save the ranch and give Eliza the justice she deserved. "We'll go at dawn," Cole said, turning from the window. He looked at Lillian, a deep, profound gratitude in his eyes. "You've already risked everything by coming here. I won't ask you to do this." "You don't have to ask," she said, her voice firm. She stood and faced him, her resolve matching his. "She brought me here for a reason. This is my fight now, too." That night, as a fragile truce settled over the house, Lillian finally remembered the other letter, the one from her sister, Catherine, still unopened in the wooden box. With everything else stripped bare, it suddenly felt important. She retrieved the box from her room and brought it to the warmth of the fire. Cole sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and deadly. He was no longer a ghost, he was a hunter. Lillian's fingers trembled as she broke the seal on Catherine's letter. She unfolded the pages, her eyes scanning the familiar, elegant script. It was, as she had expected, full of pleas for her to return to Boston, full of worry for her safety. But then, one paragraph made her blood freeze. "I know you must be desperate, Lily, but to answer an advertisement from the Barrett family. Have you forgotten what Father used to say about them? About their father, Silas Barrett, and the Wyoming land deal that ruined him? Father always swore Silas stole that land claim, that there was silver in those hills, and Silas cheated him out of his half of the fortune. Please, be careful. That family has a history of taking what isn't theirs." She looked up from the letter, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Cole. "Cole," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper, "this land, your father, did he have a partner when he first claimed it?" Cole looked up from his rifle, his brow furrowed. "A long time ago. A man from back east. My father said the man lost his nerve and sold his share for pennies before they ever found anything. Why?" "That man," Lillian said, the letter shaking in her hand. "That man was my father." The room went completely still. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. The land Martin was trying to steal, the land Eliza had died to protect. It was her birthright, too. The secret in those caves wasn't just about silver. It was about a stolen legacy. And she, Lillian Hayes, the ruined Southern belle, was the last heir to a fortune she never knew existed. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here, and they were standing in the eye of it. The revelation hung in the air between them, a silence more profound than any they had yet shared. Cole stared at her, the rifle forgotten in his hands. The tangled history of their two families, a story of betrayal and loss that spanned a generation, had just converged in this one small, isolated cabin. "Your father," he said, his voice struggling to form the words. "He was Daniel Hayes," Lillian said softly. "He lost everything after that deal fell through. He died a broken man, always talking about the treasure in the Wyoming hills that was stolen from him." Cole lowered his head, the weight of his own father's sins settling upon him. The land he had fought to keep out of love and duty was built on a foundation of deceit. "So Martin isn't just trying to steal from me," he said, his voice rough. "He's trying to finish what our father started, stealing from your family." The irony was as bitter as the winter wind. Eliza had died protecting a legacy that belonged to the very woman she had summoned to protect Cole. "It doesn't matter," Lillian said, her voice surprisingly firm. She folded the letter and placed it on the table. "What matters is stopping him. What matters is justice for Eliza, and for my father." A new fire burned in her. This was no longer just Cole's fight or even Eliza's. It was hers. It had been hers from the moment she was born. Cole looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering firelight. He saw not a fragile woman from Charleston, but a warrior. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "At dawn," he said. The words were a promise. They left before the sun had even kissed the horizon. The air was sharp and cold, the snow crunching under their boots. Cole carried his rifle, and Lillian carried a lantern and Eliza's journal, its pages a map of a different kind. The 7 dogs flanked them, moving with a silent, deadly purpose. They were no longer just pets or companions. They were a pack, and they were going hunting. They followed the path Eliza had described, up the treacherous snow-covered ridge behind the cabin. The higher they climbed, the more the wind bit at them, a relentless, icy assault. "The entrance is hidden," Cole said, his voice tight. "Behind a rock slide." Eliza wrote that she'd found it by accident as a girl. They reached the area Eliza had described, a tumble of massive boulders and fallen trees. It looked impassable. But Cole, guided by the journal's faint clues, found it. A narrow gap, almost completely hidden by snowdrifts and shadows, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He lit the lantern, its golden light pushing back against the oppressive darkness within. The air that drifted out was ancient, cold, and smelled of damp earth and stone. "Stay close," he murmured, holding the lantern high as he slipped through the opening. Lillian followed, her heart pounding, the dogs pressing in close behind her. Inside, the cave opened into a vast, silent chamber. Icicles, thick as a man's arm, hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth. The lantern light danced across the stone walls, revealing veins of quartz that glittered like trapped stars. It was beautiful and terrifying. "She wrote that she went deeper," Lillian whispered, her voice echoing in the immense space. "Past the first chamber to a smaller tunnel on the left." They moved deeper into the mountain's belly, the only sounds their own breathing and the soft padding of the dog's paws on the stone floor. They found the smaller tunnel, a dark maw that seemed to swallow the light. As they entered, the lead dog, the old hound who had first watched Lillian with such suspicion, let out a low, soft whine. Its nose was pressed to the ground. "What is it?" Lillian asked. Cole knelt, running his hand over the dog's back. "He smells something." And then Lillian saw it. Tucked into a small alcove, almost completely hidden by a rock, was a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. It was Eliza's. But as Lillian reached for it, another scent hit her, faint but unmistakable. Gunpowder. A trap. "Cole, wait!" she screamed. But it was too late. From the shadows at the end of the tunnel, a figure emerged. Martin. He held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Cole's heart. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," Martin said, a triumphant, ugly smile twisting his face. "Took you long enough, brother. Drop the rifle." Cole froze, his eyes locked on his brother's. He slowly lowered the rifle to the ground. "You followed us," Cole said, his voice seething with a rage so cold it was almost calm. "I didn't have to," Martin sneered. "I've been waiting. I knew whoever had the journal would lead me right to the map. And look at that. It even brought the little heiress along for the reunion." He gestured with the pistol towards Lillian. "Give it to me. The map." "You left her here to die," Lillian said, her voice shaking with fury. "In the dark. In the cold. She made her choice," Martin spat. "She wouldn't listen to reason. Just like you. Now, the map. Or your new protector gets a bullet in the chest." Cole took a half step in front of Lillian, shielding her with his body. "You won't get away with this, Martin." "I already have," Martin laughed, a high, unhinged sound that echoed horribly in the cave. "Once I have the silver claim, no one will care about a dead woman or a broke rancher. I'll be the king of this entire valley." Lillian's mind raced. The dogs, they were their only chance. They stood behind Martin, silent, watchful, their bodies coiled like springs. She just needed a distraction. Her eyes fell on the lantern in Cole's hand. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. "Now, Cole!" she screamed. As Cole threw the lantern at the wall, plunging the cave into a terrifying, disorienting darkness, Lillian let out a high-pitched whistle, a signal she had practiced with Scout. In the blackness, all hell broke loose. The sound was deafening. The roar of 7 dogs, a furious, vengeful chorus, filled the cave. A gunshot exploded, the muzzle flash, a brief, terrifying glimpse of chaos. Martin screaming, the dogs a whirlwind of fur and teeth. Lillian scrambled for the rifle. Her hands found the cold steel, and she gripped it, her finger searching for the trigger. Another gunshot, this one wild, ricocheting off the stone walls with a terrifying shriek. Cole tackled her, pulling her down behind a rock as stone shards rained down around them. "Stay down!" he roared. Above the snarling of the dogs, they could hear Martin's frantic, terrified screams. He was trapped. The hunters had become the hunted. The screaming stopped. A final gurgling cry, then silence. A terrible, profound silence, broken only by the low growls of the victorious dogs. Cole slowly got to his feet, pulling Lillian up with him. He found the lantern. It was dented, but the flame still flickered. He relit the wick and held it high. The scene the light revealed was gruesome. Martin lay on the floor, his pistol fallen from his hand. The dogs stood over him, not a pack of pets, but a tribunal. They were Eliza's avengers. Cole walked over and picked up the pistol, his face grim. He didn't look at his brother's body. He looked at Lillian. "It's over," he said, his voice heavy. Lillian nodded, her body trembling with adrenaline and shock. She walked to the alcove and retrieved the canvas bundle. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the knots. Inside was not just a map. It was the original signed deed, clearly showing Daniel Hayes and Silas Barrett as equal partners. And tucked within its folds was a letter. It was from Eliza, addressed to her. "To the one who comes after," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed. But it does not mean we have lost. The truth of this land is in your hands now. Protect him. Love him if you can. He is a good man who has known too much sorrow. And know this, whatever you choose, you are not alone. I will be with you, in the wind that blows across these hills, in the courage of the dogs, in the heart of the man I love. Be brave. Eliza." Tears streamed down Lillian's face as she read the words. She looked at Cole, who was watching her, his face etched with pain and gratitude. The ghosts of the past were finally at rest. They had found the truth. They had found justice. But as they stood in the silent, cold tomb of a cave, they both knew that escaping the mountain was one thing. Learning how to live in the world of the living, with the weight of all they had done and all they had lost, would be a different battle entirely, and they would have to fight it together. The journey back down the mountain was a silent procession. Cole walked ahead, the grim reality of what had happened settling on him like the snow on his shoulders. Lillian followed, clutching the deed and Eliza's final letter, her mind a whirlwind of shock and sorrow and a strange, fierce sense of peace. The dogs, their vengeance complete, trotted quietly beside them, their duty done. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The world looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. They buried Martin in the frozen ground at the far edge of the property, a simple, unmarked grave. There was no ceremony, no words spoken. It was a grim necessity, an end to a story of greed and betrayal. Later, sitting by the fire, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but clean, empty, waiting to be filled. Cole finally looked at Lillian, truly looked at her, and saw everything she was. The woman who had crossed a country on a lie, who had faced down his brother, who had walked into a dark cave and fought for a justice that was not hers to claim. "My father stole from your father," he said, his voice raw. "This land, the silver in those hills. It's half yours, Lillian. Maybe more." Lillian shook her head. She pushed the old deed across the table towards him. "No, this isn't about money, Cole. It never was. It's about home. It's about a place to belong." She looked around the simple, rough-hewn room. "My father lost his fortune. I lost my home. All I want is to stop losing things." Cole reached across the table, his calloused, work-worn hand covering hers. It was the first time he had touched her with such open, simple tenderness. "You won't," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not ever again. As long as I'm here, you will never be without a home." He stood up and disappeared into the hallway, returning a moment later with a small, carved wooden box. It wasn't her box of memories. It was his. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, was a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Then it was Eliza's." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "She wrote in her journal that she hoped I could find love again. She sent you here, Lillian. I think this was always meant for you." He took the ring from the box, his hand trembling slightly. "I know I have nothing to offer you but hard work and a broken-down ranch, and a past full of ghosts. But if you'll have me, if you'll stay, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man that you and Eliza believed I could be." Lillian's heart felt like it would burst. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. She held out her hand. "I already stayed," she whispered. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. There were no grand promises, no flowery words. There was only the simple, profound truth of two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage of the past and had chosen to build a future together. Spring came to the valley, not with a sudden rush, but slowly, gently, as if the land itself were healing. The snow melted, revealing the stubborn green shoots of new life. The creek behind the cabin began to flow again, its music a gentle counterpoint to the song of the wind. They took the deed into town, and with the truth revealed, they secured the ranch and its legacy for generations to come. The silver in the hills would provide for them, but more than that, the truth would protect them. One warm afternoon, Lillian stood on the porch, watching Cole work with the dogs in the open field. He was teaching Scout to retrieve, and his laughter, a sound she had once thought she would never hear, echoed across the valley. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He was no longer a ghost, haunted by the past. He was alive. The dogs were no longer grim sentinels. They were a joyful, chaotic family. Lillian placed a hand on her stomach, a small, secret smile playing on her lips. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with hope, and soon it would be filled with the sound of new life. She had come to Wyoming seeking refuge and found a home. She had answered a letter from a dead woman and found her destiny. The past would always be a part of their story, a tapestry of sorrow and love, betrayal and redemption. But it was no longer the only story. They were writing their own now, day by day, choice by choice. Home, she realized, wasn't a place you found. It was a place you built. It was a choice you made, to stand your ground, to fight for the people you love, and to believe in the promise of a new dawn, even after the longest, darkest winter. It was the simple, beautiful, hard-won truth of survival. If you enjoyed this story and believe that even the deepest wounds can heal, don't forget to subscribe. We've got a lot more stories to tell.